Hi everyone. Welcome to Race and Ethnic Relations, Sociology 235 for summer 2021. I'm Stephanie Hansard, and this is going to be our first video lecture for the summer. Today's lecture, we're going to go over the syllabus, but this isn't just syllabus day. We're also going to have a lecture on defining and understanding race, which will include definitions of race and ethnicity, some history of race and racism, and some theories of race and ethnicity. This will get us started with the material we need to learn for the semester. First, let's go over the course syllabus. This will tell us what to expect from the course. First of all, my name is Stephanie Hansard. Please call me Stephanie or Professor. I don't prefer to be called Dr. Hansard, even though that's correct. It's just not my preference. I like to be called Stephanie. Thank you. My goals for this course are to teach about the importance of racial and ethnic inequality and equity, and to foster productive discussions. To communicate with me, please use email. I check my email about 3 times a day, usually around 7 a.m., 10 a.m., and 2:30 p.m. If it's urgent, please mark your email urgent. That is, if you need a response within the next few hours, please go ahead and put urgent in the subject line. Otherwise, I might choose to wait until the end of the day when I have more time to answer you. Another way to get in touch with me is through my office hours. I will be on campus on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10:30 to 11:30, and I'll be sitting in my office with the door open waiting for students to come visit me. You can also make appointments with me at other times. Say, for example, after class. I'll hang around and meet with you if you need me to. Or you can schedule virtual appointments by appointment. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I am not on campus, and I will have online visits only by appointment. If you need an appointment for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or time outside of my office hours on Tuesday and Thursday, please email me. So this course is going to present a global perspective on race and ethnic relations. Generally, when we think about race and racism, we think about the United States because that's where we live. But we're going to talk about race and ethnic relations from a global perspective, meaning we're going to look at how race and ethnic structures differ globally. We're also going to talk about how race and ethnicity are socially constructed, and how sociologists study race and ethnic inequality. So each week you will do some asynchronous work, meaning work on your own without my intervention. This will include reading all assigned readings carefully. When you look at the course syllabus that's on Moodle, and you look at the course schedule, each week I have readings listed for you. I expect you to read all of those readings carefully before our Thursday discussion. Also, before our Thursday discussion, I expect you to watch the lecture, which will last about 2 hours. You'll have a journal entry to complete, which will be about 1.5 to 2 typed pages, and you'll have a reading quiz to take. More on that later. Our synchronous discussions will take place Thursdays at 12:30 on Microsoft Teams. I'll be sending out invitations for all Teams meetings by the beginning of the semester. Please arrive on time and stay the entire time. I request that you keep your camera on. I understand that sometimes this isn't possible, but it's a good way to keep us focused and to keep us present with each other. We only meet 6 times, and so I think it's important for us to really be in touch with each other when we have class. That said, I ask you to please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. This is because we all have busy lives and sometimes we have a lot of background noise in our lives. So please keep your microphone muted to avoid disruptions. The books you're going to be required to get for the course are Judy Root Aulet's A Global View of Race and Racism. This is the main text for the course. You'll read almost all the chapters in this book. It's a terrific book, and I really think you'll like it. You'll also be getting Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. The subtitle of this book is Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. And I want you to get the 5th edition of the book. That's because it's the most updated version with most up-to-date examples, but it also has a foreword that takes some current events into account. Grading. This course will be graded in a number of ways. There are only 2 exams in this course, and they're only worth 20% of the course grade each. I know a lot of courses, especially summer courses, only grade by exams, but I don't want the exams to be too high stakes. Exams are going to be short answer and long answer questions. They're going to be open note and open book, meaning you can use all your course materials to answer the exam, which should tell you right away that it's going to be mostly application questions. The exams will be cumulative, meaning that the second exam will cover material that was also tested on the first exam. I'll expect you to integrate information from across the course on the second exam. Exams are going to be due on Fridays at 5 p.m. on Moodle. Each week, you'll complete a journal entry. Notice that you only have to complete 5 journal entries, and there are 6 weeks in the course, meaning you can skip one. Journal entries, the prompts for which can be found in the syllabus on the course schedule, are worth 5% of your course grade each. Each journal entry should be a critical response to the week's reading. What I mean is, I don't just expect you to summarize the week's readings or even to tell what was important about the week's readings. I expect you to give a critical response, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you personally learned, what you found effective about the writing, what you didn't. I expect these essays to be 1.5 to 2 pages typed double-spaced. I want you to submit these on the drop boxes in Moodle and not to email them to me. If you email them to me, they will likely get lost and then we'll both be upset. These will be due each Thursday at 5 p.m. You will also take a reading quiz each week. Again, there are 5 of them, or there are 6 of them, and you only have to take 5, meaning you can skip a reading quiz and it won't kill you. However, I encourage you to take all 6 because I will drop, it won't hurt you at all. To take all 6, and they're excellent preparation for the exams. They're going to be multiple choice and true-false. What's a little different about these reading quizzes is that you get to take them as many times as you wish. You get unlimited attempts, however, you must earn 100% to get credit. So it's basically a completion grade dependent upon your trying it until you get it right. These are going to be due each Thursday at 5 p.m. Your final reflection paper is going to take the place of a term paper. I expect it to be about 5 pages long and to be a critical reflection on your entire experience of the course. So it will be just like your journal entry, but the prompt is, what did you learn in this course? I'll expect you to incorporate readings from throughout the course and reflect on those readings. It'll be due on Friday, July 2nd at 5 p.m. on Moodle. Let's talk about some policies. First, I want to talk about my late work policy. This course is only 6 weeks, and work will pile up really quickly if you fall behind. So you may submit work up to 1 class meeting late for 50% credit. What I mean is, if you have an assignment due on Thursday, like a journal entry, you can submit it by the following Tuesday at the latest. And if you do that, it will be worth 50% of the total credit you could have earned otherwise. So if you would have made an 88, you'll get a 44. If you would have made 100, you'll get a 50. This isn't great. It's not what you should aim at, but it allows you to earn some credit for submitting late work. However, after that 1 additional class period, I won't accept it because I'll already be grading the next thing. I won't allow late exams except under extraordinary circumstances. What I mean is the exams are take home and they'll be posted on Tuesday before they're due on Friday. So you have 4 days to take the exam. If something happens on the day the exam is due and you can't do the exam, you've had all week to do it. So I expect that you'll turn it in anyway. If you have something extraordinary come up, such as you get COVID or something horrible happens, let me know. I'll consider it. But I'm unlikely to let you turn in a late exam because, for example, you overslept. That won't happen. But if you have circumstances that you feel are extraordinarily taxing, please let me know. I'm a reasonable human being. Accessibility. I want to make this course as accessible as possible for every person. If you have accommodations, I want you to let me know immediately. If you don't have formal accommodations but you think you need them, please email accessibility@bsc.edu or Dr. Brown at brbrown@bsc.edu, and they can help you through the accommodations process. That said, if you just need me to adjust something I'm doing and it doesn't require me to treat you very differently from other students, please just discuss it with me. For example, if the way we're doing discussion groups isn't working out for you because of some sensory issues, and you want me to change how I do discussion groups for everybody, let me know. I'll consider it. I'll do my best. If you need me to treat you substantially differently from other students, for example, by giving you extra days to complete the exams, I need you to have accommodations for that. But if you just want me to tweak something about the course, I'll probably do it. The course schedule represents my plan for teaching the course. Changes to the course schedule may be necessary. However, I promise I will not make the course more difficult for any reason. So, for example, a change I might make is I might cut a reading because I don't think it's as relevant as maybe it seemed when I assigned it. What I won't do is add an additional reading unless I cut a reading of similar length to make up for it. And of course, I'll discuss all changes to the course schedule with you before they take effect. If you have any questions about the course, including the syllabus, please email me right away. I'm happy to discuss questions on Thursday, but it would be great if you could email them to me. So, we're going to begin lecturing for the course by talking about defining and understanding race and ethnicity. This is the first lecture of the course. We're going to go through this, and we're going to go through some history of race, which is typically lecture 2. We're basically doing 2 lectures for every one. So I want you to look when you're doing the readings and make sure you can answer these questions. So look out for these ideas when you're doing the readings. How does Aulette define race? How does Benia Silva define race? And I want you to think about which definition makes the most sense to you, Aulette's or Bonilla Silva's. So we're going to talk about defining race, and the most important thing to understand about race from a sociological standpoint is that race is a social construct. Construct means something that is built, so we're going to look at the social construction of race. That is, how is race built? So, a fact that may seem surprising to some people is that race is not biological, even though it's based on apparent physical differences. What I mean is, there's no genetic test for race. And even though we base racial categories on apparent physical differences, we don't racialize every physical difference. For example, we don't generally consider tall people to be their own race. We don't generally consider blue-eyed people to be a distinct race from brown-eyed people. We don't generally consider heavy people to be a different race from thinner people. So I want you to ask yourself and consider which apparent physical differences are racialized and which are not. So if race is not biological, but it is based on apparent physical differences, then what is race? So race is a socially constructed idea, and racial categories typically, or according to some theorists always, reflect power structures within a society. Racial categories are almost always hierarchical. It's difficult to imagine a racial structure, a system of racial categories, where all the racial categories are on equal footing. So it's hard to imagine creating races to describe groups of people and then treating all those groups of people equally. We tend to create racial categories in the form of a hierarchy. And racial stereotypes are almost always value-laden. What I mean by that is we don't tend to have stereotypes that, for example, some people like spicy food. We tend to have racial stereotypes that are value-laden. For example, some people eat animals that we think are disgusting to eat. Or some people are less honest than others based on race. So racial stereotypes are almost always value-laden. They're rarely value-neutral kind of ideas. An example of a racial stereotype that might not be value-laden, for example, you might think that stereotyping certain groups of people as taller than others isn't value-laden, but it becomes value-laden when we assume that that means they're better suited to certain tasks than other people. So we're going to talk about ways that race becomes reified. That means made real through social interaction within a society. And the resulting inequalities based on the reification of racial categories are called racism or racisms. So to summarize this, race is socially constructed in a hierarchical way and becomes real through social interaction. The differences that are made between racial categories which are socially constructed are racism. So let's break this down a little bit. First, consider a paradox. Racial categories are socially created. We talked about the fact that race is not biological and that there's no objective test for what race somebody is. Racial categories are socially created, and people are put into these created categories. And yet, racism has real impacts on people's lives. Therefore, race is imaginary. It's not biological, but its effects remain real and important because of the real impacts that racism has on people's lives. So race is simultaneously imaginary and very real. This brings us to the idea of the Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem states that situations defined as real are real in their consequences. So although race is not objectively real, it is defined as real. We treat racial categories as though they're based on objective fact. So although race is not objectively real, people are really treated differently based upon perceived race. That is, people are subjected to racist treatment. And the process of making something a social reality by treating it as real is called reification. Reification means to make real. So the process of making a social reality, something a social reality by treating it as real, is reification. So this is called race and ethnic relations. And it's important to distinguish between race and ethnicity. While race is made up, ethnicity is real. Ethnicity is the way a group of people who share a common history or way of life live. However, ethnicity is often essentialized. That is, it's treated as a biological reality. And therefore, it becomes viewed as a defining characteristic. So here's an example. Indigenous Americans are often stereotyped as being genetically or biologically allergic to alcohol or prone to alcoholism. So when you think about Indigenous Americans as a group of people who share a common history or way of life, something that was not common to Indigenous American peoples was fermentation or distilling. So making alcoholic beverages wasn't very common. When you consider that historically, Indigenous Americans have been stripped of their lands, stripped of their wealth, put onto reservations with very few resources, and experience much higher rates of poverty than other people. It makes sense why rates of substance abuse might be relatively higher in those communities. But instead of just saying, oh wow, as a group, Indigenous Americans have problems with alcohol based on lifestyle and common history, we decided to treat it as a biological reality. Native Americans can't drink. And then we viewed it as a defining characteristic, the drunken Indian. We treated it as something defining about Indigenous Americans. So for many people, to be an Indigenous American is synonymous with being an alcoholic. So we've taken something that's an ethnic difference and treated it as something natural to a people group. So race ethnicity, then, is a concept that Aulet describes as the often inextricable connection between race and ethnicity. So I'd like to start on the right of this diagram, where I say that differences in lifestyle and history are racialized. So to racialize a difference means to essentialize it, to treat it as a defining characteristic and a biological reality. So we might, for example, observe that African tribal peoples have different musical styles than European tribal peoples. We might note that the rhythms and meter and features of African music are more complex and interesting than many European traditions, but that's a subjective judgment. But then we might racialize that difference. We might say that African people are musical or musically talented because of racial differences, rather than just saying certain African cultures have very complex and interesting musical styles. We might racialize that difference to say people of African descent are musical. We might then form judgments of people of African descent as being musical, and we get things like minstrelsy, minstrel culture, where Europeans dress in blackface and mimic allegedly musical African people. So groups' realities may be shaped by racism, and then those realities shaped by racism may manifest as differences in lifestyle and history, which can then be racialized another time. So we'll talk about some examples of this later, but keep this model in mind. So race ethnicity is the dialectic, the linked ideas of racialized ethnicity and products of racism, which become differences in lifestyle and history. So now is a good idea to pause the video and try to answer the following questions. How does Aulet define race? How does Bonilla-Silva define race? And what is the Thomas theorem? Just pause the video and do a little check for understanding, and then come back. So now that we've talked about some definitions of race and ethnicity, we're going to talk for a bit about the history of race. So we talked about the fact that race is socially constructed. With race being socially constructed, we understand that race has a history. Anything that's socially constructed has a history. If something is natural, we usually can't trace when it was invented. For example, we can't trace a history of human ears. We can trace a history of an evolutionary history of creatures who had no ears, who then evolved to have ears, who then gave rise to early human ancestors. But for as long as there have been humans, humans have had ears. We can't trace a time before ears and then a time after ears. But if something is socially constructed, we can generally trace its history. We'll talk more about the history of how race was invented in a moment. Another way we can tell that race is socially constructed rather than natural is that it varies from culture to culture. If something is natural, it tends to be the same all over the world. For example, twin births. Twin births are natural. Sometimes they occur in a small percentage of all live births. There are twins. But if something is socially constructed, it varies from culture to culture. For example, baby naming. So an example of this would be in many European cultures, it's traditional to name your child Junior, to give a son the exact same name as its father, and call that child a junior. But in Jewish culture, it's considered a bad thing to do to name your baby after a living relative. You should name your baby after an ancestor who's passed away, instead of after, for example, his father. So, baby naming varies from culture to culture. So in this section, we're going to consider when and how and why race was invented. We're going to talk about two theories of how race was invented with examples. And we're going to talk about how race has been reified in our society. First, let's think about when, how, and why race was invented. So, we said that race has a history, and we can know that it's socially constructed because it has a history. So, the colonial history of race is the phenomenon whereby when Europeans started colonizing the rest of the globe outside of Europe, they began to racialize the people they encountered. That is, they began to essentialize their ethnicity. They began to treat them as categorically different. They did this by defining European culture, religion, and bodies as superior, defining indigenous people as culturally, morally, and biologically inferior, and then using these narratives to justify exploitation. So think about this dialectic between economic exploitation and racialization. Aulet says that economic exploitation through globalization and colonialism has everything to do with how groups became racialized. So here, let's start on the left. I want to take the resources controlled by other groups. This other group has something that I want. Maybe it's land, maybe it's labor, maybe it's mineral wealth, maybe it's a natural resource. They have it and I want it. Well, the problem is, if I view those other groups as essentially human and equal to me in all important ways, it might be really hard for me to just exploit them. That is, it might be hard for me to psychologically justify their exploitation. But if I can racialize that other group, by defining them as essentially inferior to me and my group, then I can justify taking their resources because they're not really people in the same way that I am. So go back to Bonilla Silva's argument that racial categories are almost always hierarchical and based on power relations. In this case, it's based on material relations. I want to categorize other groups as essentially inferior to me and my group so that I can justify taking the resources they control. This brings us to two related theories on the invention of race. The first one I want us to consider is the racial formations theory by Olmi and Winant. Racial formations theory states that racial ideologies are based on social relationships that are unequal, that group differences become racialized, and that racial categories are maintained through violence and coercion. So, racial ideologies are based on social relationships that are unequal, meaning I create racial categories around existing power differentials. Maybe I encounter a society with different technologies than mine, and my particular technologies give me an advantage in a particular situation or context. So, for example, maybe I have gunpowder propelled weaponry. Well, I may not have all the same technologies as a different culture, but if they don't have gunpowder based weaponry, then I have an advantage in terms of military relations. So I have a social relationship that's unequal. I have guns and they don't. I create categories. My group, which has guns as weaponry, versus their group that doesn't. And then I racialize those differences. I say, you know what? This group that didn't develop gunpowder, they must not be as advanced as me and my group. This group that didn't invent gunpowder, well, look at them. They look different, and they speak a different language, and they practice a different religion. All of these things must be why they don't have gunpowder. So I create a category of other. And then I maintain those categories through violence and coercion. I might, for example, use my gunpowder to take things that belong to the group I've racialized because I see them as essentially inferior. A related but slightly different theory is that of hegemony. Most people pronounce this hegemony. Some people pronounce it hegemony. I'm going to go with hegemony because that's what I'm comfortable with, but I won't judge anyone who pronounces it differently. And it's by a theorist named Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci wrote in the 70s, before Olmi and Winant, who wrote in the early 2000s. And Gramsci said that in a given social situation, the more powerful group in the relationship will construct elaborate narratives of their own superiority. Not only will they create racialized categories, but they will begin to construct narratives about why their group is superior. So, under racial formations theory, group differences have been racialized. We've said, look at these folks. They speak different languages. They practice different religions. They have different forms of governance. Under hegemony, we create narratives about how our religion is better, how our language is more perfect, how our systems of governance are superior. They're more efficient. They're more egalitarian. They're more whatever. And whatever differentiates us from them, ours is better. We'll create all these stories about why our group is better than another group, and then we'll teach those narratives through every avenue until they become common sense. We'll teach them in school. We'll teach them in churches. We'll teach them in writing. We'll teach them through media, through entertainment, through sport, through advertising. And we'll teach them until nobody even thinks about them at all. We'll teach them until they are so commonsensical that most people aren't even aware that they know them. And thus, racial categories are maintained through what Gramsci calls consent, but I prefer to call persuasion. Or brainwashing. We haven't gained authentic consent because we never gave anyone an alternative. But by teaching these narratives of our own group's superiority, we've managed to create categories that are maintained through consent and persuasion. That is, people don't question these categories. People don't question the narratives of the dominant group's superiority. They just are brainwashed. They're just inundated with them until they accept them. So here are some examples of how racial formations and hegemony worked through colonialism and how racialization took place. So I'm going to talk about these three examples: Spanish missions in North America, the British Raj in India, and Belgian capitalism in the Congo. I'm going to talk about them in very broad terms, and I'm going to give a rather sanitized version. That is, I'm not going to talk about the weight and the gravity of the atrocities that were committed. That's because I don't want to traumatize anybody. But please, if you feel led to read up on these examples from history, I can recommend some readings. But be aware that what I'm about to say is the light version. So through Spanish missions in North America, Spanish colonizers, conquistadors, brought with them Catholic missionaries, Catholic priests, who defined indigenous nations as spiritually inferior. They categorized them and racialized them based on non-Christian religion. They then exploited the agricultural and mineral wealth that rightfully belonged to the indigenous nations. And they maintained their hierarchy through both overt violence, as described in the racial formations theory by Omi and Wynett, and through religion, essentially creating hegemony. They created narratives of their spiritual superiority as Catholics, and the inferiority of indigenous religions, which they then perpetuated and taught through religion. So this can be read as an example of both racial formations theory and hegemony. We can see how both of those phenomena are at play here. So the British Raj in India is a good example of racial formations theory, kind of at its finest. When the British colonized the Indian subcontinent, they defined Indians as culturally inferior. They defined the technologies that the British excelled at as being more important than the technologies that Indians excelled at. Indians, for example, excelled in printing technology, excelled in weaving and dyeing and textile technology, and many agricultural technologies. There are many technologies where the Indians excelled the British, but because the British excelled the Indians in weaponry and warfare, they defined those as the most important forms of technology and defined Indians as culturally inferior. They then went on to exploit the agricultural, mineral wealth, and technology of Indians. And they maintain this hierarchy for centuries through overt violence and also through economic domination. So, economic domination here would be a form of coercion. And finally, I'm going to talk about a less discussed example, which is Belgian capitalism in Congo. It's now, the region we're talking about is now mostly subsumed under the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also includes other African nations. And this is where my caveat that I'm giving you the light version really comes into play. There's nothing really worse than what I'm about to describe. If you want more information on this, read King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. But I'm going to give you a light version. Belgian colonizers, defined the indigenous people of the Congo as culturally and spiritually inferior. The people of the Congo region had many natural resources, but they were largely hunter-gatherer societies. They didn't cultivate these resources in the way that Europeans might have done because they didn't really have any need to. They were thriving and living very happy lives with effective self-governance without cultivating their natural resources in the way Europeans wanted to under capitalism. So they were defined as culturally inferior because they weren't using resources the way Europeans would have. They were also defined as spiritually inferior because they didn't practice Christianity. The Belgian colonizers committed genocide to extract rubber, cocoa, and gold. They murdered and enslaved millions of indigenous people in the Congo, forcing them to harvest the raw materials of latex, rubber sap, cocoa, and gold. And they maintain this hierarchy through violence, but also through religion, and also through economic domination. So there are elements of both racial formations and hegemony at play here. So why was race invented? Largely to justify unjust treatment. Racialization dehumanizes the bodies and identities of racialized persons. Remember that racial categories are always hierarchical. When we define a group of people as less than us, we're essentially defining them as less than human. We're essentially saying we're full people and you're something else. It almost always denigrates the racialized cultures. So when we racialize a group of people, we're almost always saying that they're culturally inferior. And it infantilizes racialized groups, like the Belgians did in the Congo and the British did on the Indian subcontinent. It essentially says, look at these silly people. They're not taking full advantage of the resources available to them. They're not cultivating those resources the way we would. They need our help. So it dehumanizes, denigrates the cultures, and infantilizes the humanity of racialized groups, thus allowing the dominant group to justify doing whatever we want to them. So if you want to horribly exploit someone, you first have to distance yourself from them. And Europeans largely racialized African and indigenous American people as a means of distancing and dehumanizing them. The ultimate example of this is in the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is often called the Ma'afa by sub-Saharan African peoples. It's a word that means great catastrophe. It's a way to describe the genocide that took place when African people were taken en masse from their homes, destroying villages, destroying ways of life, destroying societies, and destabilizing economies. So Europeans used the racialization of African people to create racial categories that could then be used to justify the slave trade. By dehumanizing, denigrating, and infantilizing Africans, Europeans were able to justify imprisoning them and enslaving them. So we talked about the process of reification and how race became real. So if we've talked about the two theories, racial formations and hegemony, for how race becomes created. But race has been reified, that is, made into a social fact in several ways for centuries, including religion, biological science, and social science. So this is a picture from a German magazine printed in 1911, and the image is entitled "The Five Races of Mankind." So notice the European-looking man in the middle, in the front in the middle, looming larger than the others. Behind him is an Indigenous American person, an Australian Aboriginal person, an African person, and an Asian person. These were believed to be, in 1911, the types of people that there were, the racial categories that were real. This categorization of human beings came out of the coincidence of colonialism and the kind of obsession with Enlightenment thinking and taxonomy. Taxonomy meaning to categorize nature. So we were beginning in Europe at this time, around the time of colonialism, so well before 1911, thinking all the way back to colonialism in the 14 and 1500s and the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans, at the same time that they were colonizing the world, were also beginning to categorize nature obsessively. So they were beginning to categorize plants, animals, geographies, topographies. All these categorizing schools of thought were emerging at around the time of colonialism. So human taxonomies were created around the same time. So notice that everyone except the European person in this etching are smaller and shadowier than the European person, implying that the European person is in the back, or is, the norm, the natural dominant group. And everyone else is shown kind of in comparison to him. So in social science, we use the census to create racial categories. So I've included a link in the slides that you'll see on Moodle to census.gov. And the link, if you click it, will take you to all the race questions that have ever been asked on the United States Census. The point of this is to see how categories have changed over time. So what I'm showing you here is from the 1790 census, and it asks for color, whether white, black, or mulatto. This is the 1800 census. White, black, or mulatto were your choices. And notice that it was called color, not race or ethnicity. So you were asked to define yourself in one of those three categories. And if you were none of those three categories, you just didn't fit. So this is how social scientists have over the years reified race. we've told people what categories there were that they could fall into and forced them to pick, thus treating race as a social reality. Through biological science, you can think of the kinds of taxonomies that I described of human beings, but you can also think of the eugenics movement, the goal of which was to improve the national population by limiting who reproduced, thus improving the gene pool. Eugenic means well-born. So the goal was to encourage sound-bodied white people to reproduce, and disabled people and people of color were prevented from reproducing, often through horrific means. So this is a good time to check for understanding. It's a good time to pause the video and see if you can answer, what is hegemony? When were modern racial categories invented? And what is reification? So, having covered all this material, I want us to talk about what comes next. So on Thursday, I want you to prepare to discuss the following questions. According to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, all Americans are steeped in white supremacy. Does this mean that all white people are racist? Why or why not? Bonilla Silva describes systems as racist. How can systems be racist? And finally, Bonilla Silva describes modern racial dynamics as colorblind racism. Why is colorblindness a problem? Isn't it what we should all strive for? What does he mean by colorblind racism? So I'd like you to think about these questions and prepare to discuss them in our group on Thursday. So remember that for this week, you're going to complete Reading Quiz 1 and submit Journal Prompt 1. The prompt is in the syllabus under week 1. And on Thursday at 12:30, you're going to attend the discussion meeting on Teams. It's a good time, since reading is somewhat light over the weekends, to go ahead and get a jump on reading for next week. You're going to read Owlette, Chapter 4. You're going to read the Du Bois article, The Study of the Negro Problems. You're going to read Bonilla Silva, Chapter 3 and 4, and an article on Moodle by Bonilla Silva called Rethinking Racism Toward a Structural Interpretation. So you've got 1 chapter in Owlette, 2 chapters in Bonilla Silva, and 2 articles. So you might want to go ahead and get a jump on that, since it's kind of a lot. If you have any questions about anything that you've learned in this lecture, please feel free to email me. If you have any questions about the course or the syllabus, please email me. And if you need to talk or just want to say hello, please feel free to schedule a meeting or come to my office hours on Tuesday or Thursday. I'd love to meet you in person. All right. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful week.